Hello everyone, I'm here with Griselda Molemans, a research journalist, a documentary maker and the author of this book, A Lifetime of War.
Exactly.
The book is about the rape crimes, the forced prostitution by the Japanese Imperial Army
and
Navy between 1932 and 1945, right?
Correct. Well done.
I knew the term comfort women. In Korea, it's well known, people talk about it. But I never knew that Dutch women were a victim.
That is because the former Dutch East Indies, Indonesia, used to be a Dutch colony. Every single colony in the Far East, be it American or British, Australian or Dutch, has been overrun by the Japanese. And that's the reason why so many women, so many European and Asian women have become victims.
And to get an understanding of the scale, about how many women are we talking, like in total?
Well, based on documents, on all the evidence I discovered over the past 10 years, my estimate is around 500,000, but we'll never know because so much of the evidence has been destroyed by the Japanese. Let's say the common narrative is 200,000 victims, mostly Korean, and it appears to be a lot more.
And how many Dutch women?
When we're discussing the Dutch East Indies, I always say it's a combination.
Yeah.
It is Caucasian, white women, it is mixed women, Eurasian, and the indigenous women, whether Indonesian, Moluccan, or Papua. My conclusion is at least 70,000.
Why at hell on earth did the Japanese create this system?
Well, they learned their lessons from earlier warfare against the Soviets, the early wars, the Russo-Japanese wars, and one of the conclusions that was drawn at the headquarters in Tokyo was that too many men died of venereal diseases. So one of the things that they started developing was a cure against venereal diseases. I mean, we have to name it the way it is. I'm sorry, it's a very unpleasant subject. And then by 1932, it became apparent, it became so important because at that time, when the Japanese were invading cities on the Chinese mainland and in Manchuria, so many Japanese soldiers were raping women. This combination of trying to prevent the rapes and as well trying to safeguard the sexual health of the soldiers meant that the first few so-called comfort stations were opened. There were strict rules. So everybody who would enter, who would pay for a visit, had to prove that they were sexually healthy. It was discovered that the system helped in a certain way, but not for the full 100%, because rapes continued. They could only supply women for officers and a part of the lower ranks, the soldiers.
I knew about comfort women, but not that it was such an international problem and not only a Korean problem. I always thought it's a Korea-China problem. But how is that possible that nobody really knows about the scale of this terrible event?
Primarily because your adopted country, Korea, has been the most vocal about this war issue, which still hasn't been solved. And we should both stress the fact that North Korea has also been vocal. In the past, I mean, the president, you gotta help me here.
Kim Il-sung?
Kim Il-sung.
Kim Jong-il?
Both father and son have, and mostly the father, has always stressed that it is an issue that he takes very highly, and that indicates the position of the Koreans. And then, of course, China has been another vocal supporter of the issue. And then if you ask about the other involved countries, then it really is a sad story. So I guess each and every country involved, save for the Koreas, save for China, has made their own choices. And the choice is trade relations with Japan.
But it was most shocking to read in the book that after liberation, after the war, all the perpetrators, they were pardoned after some time, or the punishment was lowered, and I was like, why?
What happened was that there was, of course, the big tribunal in Tokyo, the Tokyo trial. There were some reports in Dutch newspapers, so people, if they were interested, they could follow up on what happened. Of course, they were more versed and more interested in what happened in Nuremberg because of the German occupation. So the Tokyo tribunal over here in the Netherlands has always been something of a side note, a footnote.
The tribunal finds Tokyo guilty under count 54.
And sentences to death by hanging the man who suicidally led Japan to stab America in the back.
Right after the Tokyo tribunals, there was a number of so-called temporary war tribunals in Indonesia, at that time still called Dutch East Indies, but it was in between becoming an independent nation. I mean, the verdicts came out and They weren't published in newspapers. Most people thought, okay, there have been convictions of war criminals, and so these guys, probably all these guys, have served jail time. They got what they deserved.
Yeah.
And then the shocking truth is that they were bailed out after 10 years. So most of the convicted war criminals spend, say, tops like 5-6 years in the Sugama prison in Tokyo.
Yeah.
And the reason being that the Dutch government sided with the Allied government, saying we really need Japan as a buffer zone against the rise of Chinese communism.
Yeah.
So we better be a little lenient and please sign here, and so we'll sign for the release of the criminals. That decision to release the war criminals was never published because the then government, the Prime Minister Drees, with his team of ministers, knew one thing for sure: if they would announce that, all hell would break loose. Most people in the Netherlands, I would say 99.9%, was absolutely clueless about the Japanese system. So their very simplistic way of reasoning was the Germans had relations with Dutch girls. Of course, I mean, in any war, people fall in love. The horrible term that they used was, in Dutch you say moffenhoer, so it's crowd whore.
Yeah.
So their reasoning was, okay, if we have crowd whores in the Netherlands, then we had Jap whores in Indonesia.
Yeah.
And that stigma stuck. A few women who would actually come out in the 40s, in the late 40s, and tell about the way they were, sexually exploited, immediately got struck down or received that stigma, Jap whore.
Terrible, because you have to deal with the experience itself, then with the trauma, and on top of that, whole society who is against you, saying that you are a prostitute.
The first Caucasian Dutch woman, Jan Raffel Herne, who came forward, who identified as a victim of forced prostitution back in 1992, she mentioned that when she was talking with her mom upon arrival in the Netherlands, how to deal with her war past, the first thing her mother said, don't talk about it, because you will be perceived as damaged goods and you will never marry, so be quiet. And if you're not being quiet, you also bring shame on our family. It's such a heavy load that these young women had to carry with them.
I also was surprised to read about Lisbeth List, because I know her well. She's a famous singer, Ramses Shaffi, but her mother was a victim as well, and she didn't know that until a very old age, right?
Yes.
How did she find out about that?
She was a baby. She was a year and a half when her mother and herself were interned in a Japanese camp. She was about 7 years old or a little older when her mother and her were transported to a temporary base in the island of Ceylon, Sri Lanka. When I interviewed her, she told me that it's a blur. It's like very vague what happened, and she was told by her father that her mother had left this earth. I mean, her mother had killed herself. The reason her father gave was, he said, she was so tormented by those years of internment and something must have happened to her. The Japs must have driven her crazy because of the starvation.
Yeah.
And nothing else was mentioned. And her father remarried, and Lisbeth List struck out on her own. When she was 17, she started her own musical career.
Yeah.
And then, 10 years later, she gave her first interview on her early years in Indonesia. An elderly woman who was interned at that same time, together with Lisbeth and her mother, wrote her a letter saying, I have extra information on your mother. If you would like to talk to me, I would love to tell you more. And then finally, another 10 years later, she was given all the letters that her father and her mother had written to each other right after the war. She put all the letters next to each other, started reading in that intricate handwriting of her parents, and then she finally got the confirmation that it was a sort of veiled way. Her mother wrote to her husband, I really want to see you, but I can't see you at the same time because I'm so ashamed. I'm so ashamed of what happened. Yeah. And then she says something, and she writes something of, I will bring shame on our family because I will give birth to a dark child. Lisbeth's father had this interpretation, and he said, like, she must have gone crazy. What is she saying? What does she mean, a black child? He didn't realize what really happened in that internment camp. It's painful to realize that almost every single decision that the Dutch government made over the past 75 years has been ruled by money interests.
Yeah.
So I don't know where it lands right now. I mean, the book's out and there's some interest, but there's more interest from the other countries involved. Yeah.
Well, I hope that the Koreans are watching now. You know, they feel a bit stronger and to stay vocal. That they know that they're not alone because they are not. Yeah.
No, just the fact that this might serve as another little push and a little.
I hope so, and a reminder.
And a reminder that there's in all these 35 countries, city-states, and autonomous regions, there are actually women, people in general, alive who are pushing this on the agenda.
It feels very good to put this story out. People deserve to know the truth, and the Koreans should know they are not alone in this. What a terrible event, and so many heartbreaking stories. Thank you, Griselda, thank you for the book, and all of you, thank you for watching. See you next time.